Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is on stacked ordering games in the logic game section. In today's lesson on stacked ordering games, we want to cover the following: how to spot one, what the process is to take on a stacked ordering game, and some of the different features that you might expect to experience when you're working on stacked ordering games like subgroups, non-one-to-one, and frames. In the world of logic games, 50% of all games are ordering games, and 17% of all games are stacked ordering games. So it's a major player. It's something that you should expect to see. And this is the kind of game where you can start to see those who have prepared for the LSAT versus those who have not prepared for the LSAT. Those who have can start to pull away because their organizations are so much different that inferences are now much more apparent than they would be otherwise. So how do you spot that you're on a stacked ordering game? Well, first, you're looking for an ordering scenario, which is fairly common. 50% of all games are ordering games. But then you're looking for a specific subset of those. So really the way you figure it out is that you're dealing with multiple variable sets. And most importantly, they're not connected at the start of the game. So this isn't the kind of game where some of the files are red files and some of the files are green files and some of the files are blue files. You know, in that scenario, they're telling you who's who. But in a stacked ordering game, they're not telling you who's who. That information needs to be gleaned as you move throughout the game, and it can change from one question to the next. So the rules that you should expect to encounter are pretty common to ordering games in general, but position exclusions, ruling out a particular player from a specific position, or a relative relationship such that like K is earlier than L, where placing one player in the game board doesn't necessarily determine exactly where the other one goes. There are several ways in which this relationship can be mapped onto the game board. Fixed relationships are where there's only one mapping available. So you're looking for blocks and anti-blocks, maybe even split blocks. And then conditional relationships. So if-then relationships where if some kind of a trigger has occurred, then you need to know that the outcome needs to be applied in that particular hypothetical. So here's a stacked ordering game. And remember, the first thing you want to do is to put together a good game board. And the game board is actually probably the most important here in stacked ordering games compared to other game types, because a good organization is really half the battle to making inferences. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a complicated game board. And the way you glean it is, generally speaking, you're looking at an ordering scenario with multiple rows in order to track that information. So if we know that each of 6 tasks will be demonstrated exactly once at a farm exhibition, so there's one variable set. These 6 tasks need to be presented. They do go on to say that no 2 tasks will be demonstrated concurrently, giving you a hint that this is an ordering game. And then they go on to tell you that there are 3 volunteers, F, G, and L, will each demonstrate exactly 2 of the tasks. So there will be 2 Fs, 2 Gs, and 2 Ls. We don't know which of the volunteers is performing which task. We have to figure that out as we go, and it can change from question to question. So now that we have got a good game board, the next thing we need to do is notate the rules. So if we look at that first rule, it's actually a pretty complicated rule. It's important to pay attention to the language here. Frank demonstrates exactly 1 task before Gladys demonstrates any of the tasks. So there is exactly 1 Frank before any of the Gladyses. And so you could map this out with like Frank is before the first Gladys and before the second Gladys. And obviously the second Gladys is going to be after the first Gladys. Now, the next part is to notice that they say that there's exactly 1 Frank before any of the Gladyses. That means that the other Frank has to come after that first Gladys. And whether that first Frank or that second Frank is before the second Gladys or vice versa, we don't know. But we do know that there's going to be 1 Frank and then 1 Gladys, and then it can do whatever they want for the rest of for the other 2. So then the next rule tells us that Frank performs neither the first nor the last demonstration, so we're just going to exclude Frank from those first positions. Now notice that we're already dealing with a situation where there are only 3 options for the bottom row, F, G, and L. And they've just excluded one of those options from both the first position and the last position. So now we're down to 2. It's either going to be G and L in position 1 and G and L in position 6. The next rule says that Gladys demonstrates neither harvesting nor milling. So if H cannot perform G and M cannot perform G, we can just express that with a couple of anti-blocks. And since G and M are in different rows, we can represent that anti-block in a vertical arrangement. So likewise for H and G. So the next rule says that Gladys demonstrates neither harvesting nor milling. So we can express that information with anti-blocks stacked on top of each other so that H and G aren't going to go into the same position and M and G aren't going to go into the same position. Notice that what we're trying to do is we're just converting these words into notational structures that allow us to understand that information much more quickly, so we don't have to go back into the words and keep understanding that information, that we can essentially build puzzle pieces and then use the puzzle pieces to operate the game. The next rule tells us that L demonstrates neither harvesting nor threshing, so we can do the same thing. A couple of anti-blocks stacked vertically. H and L don't go into the same position, as well as T and L don't go into the same position. Finally, M is the next task demonstrated after threshing is demonstrated. So M is right after T, and so we can express that in a horizontal block in terms of the adjacent positions. So T and then M. So now that we've got the rules notated, we may want to also pay attention to the fact that P, S, and W were not mentioned in any of the rules. So those three elements are actually floaters. And sometimes it's generally a good idea to go ahead and underline them or circle them or somehow draw your attention to those three so that you can reference back to when you're filling in a hypothetical as you're answering a question. Generally what you're doing is you're working through the rules. So the way in which the rules connect is how you make your inferences. Which means that by the time you get done with that chain of inferences, the players that haven't been placed are typically those floaters. And so it's a nice idea to have them underlined or marked or some way so that when you're referencing back to the roster of elements, that your eyes are attracted to them more quickly. So now we go on to make some inferences and see what we know has to be true. Well, what do we know? Well, let's think about that last position or that first position. Let's think about the first position, since we know that Frank can't go first. Now, we know that the first Frank is going to precede the first Gladys. So that means that Gladys can't go first. And since Frank can't go first and Gladys can't go first, the only one left that can go first is going to be Leslie. So we can put L into the first position. And then if we're looking for other rules that are connected, if there's one piece of advice I could give you on a stacked ordering game, is that as you're looking at the inferences, like a very critical part of operating one of these games well is to linger on the setup before you hit the questions. You could just notate the rules and then plow into the questions, and that might work for a standard ordering game. But on a stacked ordering game, there's generally more complexity to the game that you can figure out. And then if you have that going into the questions, you're going to be in much better shape. So linger on those inferences and try to give yourself a chance to look for elements that are in more than one rule or positions that have more than one rule affecting it. Find a way in which you can kind of see how these rules connect and maybe something else comes from that. So for example, if we're looking at the rules for other players that are repeated throughout those rules, notice in our anti-blocks that H can't go with G and H can't go with L. So if H can't go with G and H can't go with L, but H has to go with somebody, H is going to have to go with F. And so we can go ahead and express that as a new rule. Now, I'm not a huge fan of writing out the implications of rules as new rules very often, but because this is such a concrete, nice rule, I would probably recommend doing so in this case. What else can we infer? So the last thing you might want to consider when you're working on a stacked ordering game are frames, and whether or not it's going to be in your interest to set up 2 or maybe more frames in order to try to capture the information in the game. This game type is frame heavy. So it's not a bad idea to look for it. And there's 2 common triggers that you want to be looking out for. One is blocks. And in this case, we do have a block. It's the TM block. But the TM block is not very limited in terms of where it can go. It looks like it can go 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5. It looks like it can go everywhere. So that block doesn't seem to be very helpful. But there's also something else that is common to framing, which is partial trees. So we have this partial tree with the F's and the G's. And so when you see a partial tree, maybe you want to be thinking about, is there anybody in that tree that seems to be limited in terms of where it can go? And in this case, that first F, we know that first F can't go first. We also know that first F, it can't go last. It needs at least 3 elements behind it. So F1, the latest it can go is going to be 3rd. And since that only leaves 2 positions for F1, 2nd and 3rd, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and see if you can create some frames around that, make any inferences that follow, and use those to answer the questions. So we can run out 2 game boards, one where F is in 2 and one where F is in 3. And then it looks like we're going to have more luck if we look at game board B first, because we can determine that the two G's and the F are going to have to come back behind that F and 3. So it kind of fills out that whole area. And since we can't put F in 6, we're going to have to put G in 6. And then we're going to have to put, and it's not going to be the first G, obviously, that's going to be the last element. So that's going to be the second G, which means that we're going to have one more G and an F to place. They're going to have to go in 4 and 5. And that leaves L for position 2. So we're actually able to get the whole bottom row in game board B. If we look at the top game board A, we have a lot more flexibility. The elements that are behind that F1 are 3, 4, 5, and 6. We don't really exactly know. And there's an L that can go in there as well. Like, it's much less determined. So, having started this venture of creating frames, I was hoping for more, but that's okay. We have something that we can now use as we answer the questions. So now we're ready to go attack the questions. So here's the first question in this game. Pause this lesson, try this one on your own, and when you think you've got an answer, hit play again, and we'll continue. All right, so this is a common question type. It's called a rules question. Very frequently, the first question in every game is a rules question, where you basically get a chance to get comfortable with the rules. They're just checking to see whether you understand them properly. If you don't have the rules down properly, this game is just going to be really hard to operate. So this is kind of a good proving ground to figure out whether you're on track or off track. So you want to take the rules one at a time, knock out the wrong answer choices. If we take that first rule about exactly one F preceding any of G's, well, that's going to break answer choice B because both F's are before any of G's. So we can get rid of answer choice B. If we look at the next rule, rule 2, that F can't go first or last, well, that breaks answer choice A because they have got F first. If we look at the third rule about H and M not going with G, that's going to break answer choice D since G is doing H there. And then the next rule about L not doing either H or T, well, it doesn't seem to break a rule. So we can kind of pass over that one. And then we can look at the last rule. T and M need to be consecutive. That breaks answer choice E and allows us to choose answer choice C and move to the next question. And that's essentially the process that you want to be taking. Just take the rules one at a time, knock out the wrong answer choices. The thing that's remaining is the right answer. Move on to the next question. It's the safest way to go. So the next question is called a local question. Meaning they're going to give you some new piece of information. And when you're operating a game like this with frames and you're on a local question, you want to make sure that you're, well, first off, figuring which frames are applicable and then running any inferences that follow in both of those frames. Go ahead and give this question a try. When you think you've got an answer, come back and we'll work it through together. So they're telling us that G demonstrates P immediately before F demonstrates T. G does P immediately before F does T. If we look at the two game boards, we've got more clarity in the bottom game board. So let's go ahead and think about where we can have G demonstrating P before F does T. The only place where we see G right before F is in 4 and 5. So we would have to put P and T into 4 and 5. And because of the last rule, we'd have to put M in 6. Now, we've got a problem, though, because the third rule tells us that M and G can't be assigned to the same position. So the bottom game board, once we started to try to figure out where we could put this new information, turned into a situation that just broke. And so we know that the second game board is not applicable. If this is going to be true, it's going to be true in the top game board. So then we want to think about where are we going to put our PGTF block? Well, we might think about putting it in 4 and 5, or we might think about putting it in 3 and 4. But in either case, something has to be true. Like the question is saying, which one of the following must be true, right? And we don't really know where this block goes in the top game board. So maybe the thing that must be true isn't related to where that block goes, but something else. Another thing to keep in mind, if we look down at our rules, that H and F must be assigned to the same position. And there's only one F that doesn't have anyone assigned to it. That's the one that's sitting there in 2. So we know for sure that the second position is going to have H and F in it. Can we figure out anything else? Well, we have one more L, one more G. They can go back in 5 and 6. Not exactly clear where they're going to go. Maybe we get lucky. So let's go ahead and see what happens in the answer choices. If you look at answer choice A, F demonstrates H for the second demonstration. That's exactly what we just discovered. That's our answer. Mark it and move on to the next question. So the key is that even if you don't know exactly where something is going to go or that new piece of information is going to go, when they're telling you that something must be true, that means regardless of where you put it, something is going to follow. And so you might just try plugging it in somewhere and see what comes. And then maybe try plugging it somewhere else and see if that same thing comes. If it comes both times, then it's something that must be true. Mark it, move to the next question. So we got one more question here. It's a global question, meaning there isn't a new piece of information for you to apply. You're simply going to see if it's possible in any situation. Go ahead and give this one a try. And when you want to discuss it together, go ahead and hit play again. All right. So the first thing we want to do is go to answer choice A and plug it in and see if we can make it work. If we can make it work, we pick it and move on to the next question. If we can't make it work, we go on to the next answer choice. So if we look at A, H is demonstrated first. Remember, we inferred that L was going to go first. And H and L don't go together, so we can't put H first. Let's get rid of A. If we go to B, M is demonstrated second. If we put M second, well, that means that we're going to have to put T first, right? Because of that block with T and M. And they tell us that T and L don't get along, so that's not going to work. If we look at answer choice C, T is demonstrated first. That's the same thing as in answer choice B, putting M second. That's literally the same thing. So not going to work for us. If we look at answer choice D, T is demonstrated last. If we try to put T last, well, that's not going to leave any room for M. So we can get rid of D. We'll work through a lot of cases that didn't work, but hopefully answer choice E works. So if we put W first, what do we know? Remember, W was a floater. So that shouldn't have too many implications with the rules. Let's see what happens. If we put in P second, not breaking any rules yet, we're going to still need to get the H with the F. Maybe we put the H with the F in third. What else are we going to need to do? Well, we've got P, we got S, we've got M and T. What can we do with S, M, and T? We need to make sure that the M doesn't end up on a G. So we need to make sure that the M goes on 5 and then the T goes on 4. And that's going to leave S for position 6. Let's see if this works. Check it against the rules. Is there exactly one F before any of the G's? Yes. Is T and M consecutive? Yes. Is H with F? Yes. We don't have a G with either H or with M. True. We don't have an L with either an H or a T. True. Satisfies all the rules. You do want to get into the habit of double checking each of the rules because, sometimes when you're placing elements into a hypothetical, you're satisfying each rule locally, but somehow the hypothetical you come up with at the end doesn't satisfy all of the rules collectively. And so it's not a bad idea to get into the habit. Once you've placed everybody into the hypothetical, go ahead and test it against the rules and make sure you're not breaking anything. Okay, so that's it for this particular question. Let's talk about some of the features you're going to see. Now, subgroups is not terribly uncommon. It's not terribly common either, but it's something you might experience. Subgroups is when you have different kinds of players. And I'm not just talking about multiple variable sets, but I'm talking about within a variable set that there are different kinds of players. So let's imagine we've got a game here. 3 invasive plant species, F, G, and H, and 3 indigenous plant species, T, U, and V, will be exhibited consecutively. And then now we go back to something similar. 3 volunteers, R, S, and T, will each assist with exhibiting exactly 2 of the plant species. So this is very much like the last game. The only difference is that in that first variable set, we've got 2 different kinds. We've got some that are invasive plant species and some that are indigenous plant species. And we're still going to have to deal with the volunteers who are going to be demonstrating them or exhibiting them. So we can deal with this by simply, either creating like a character, like a slash between the 2 sets. Or maybe you might want to put some characters in uppercase and some characters in lowercase. Maybe you even want to use subscripts. Those are all good ways of trying to separate the characters if you need to. I find that because they're typically separated in the alphabet by far enough space that it's generally not too hard to keep track of who's who. But if you find it challenging at all, definitely use uppercase, lowercase. That works better when you have 2 kinds of subgroups instead of 3 kinds of subgroups. But if you do end up with 3 kinds of subgroups, maybe subscripts would work as well. You're just going to use multiple rows, but now one of those rows is going to have different kinds of characters to keep track of as you go. So the next feature to consider is those stacked ordering games where you have a non-one-to-one correspondence. So this one's got a little bit more frequency. 20% of stacked ordering games have a non-one-to-one correspondence type structure. And this is where you have an uneven number of players to positions. So you might have a game where you have 5 plant species, F, G, H, J, and K, and they're going to be exhibited Monday and between Monday and Saturday of a given week. So no more than 1 plant species is exhibited on a given day. And then we've got these 3 volunteers, R, S, and T, will each assist with exhibiting at least one of the plant species. Some differences here. So in terms of the game board, we're not going 1 through 6, but we're going Monday through Saturday, which is fairly similar. And we're going to try to exhibit these 5 plant species. We also know that we've got no more than 1 plant species exhibited on a given day, but we've got 6 days and 5 plant species. So we've got an uneven number of players to positions. We also have these volunteers to keep track of. So in both rows, we actually have a non-one-to-one correspondence situation. But the one that's more important is the F, G, H, J, and K, because that's going to leave some of these positions, some of these days, or potentially some of these days empty. So if we're going to put no more than 1 plant species on a given day, and these plant species are each going to be exhibited once, then that's going to mean that one of these days is not going to have anything exhibited. And so you might start to keep track of that by slashes or whatever. And that might also be a place where you might be able to create some frames. Like, for example, if you're able to figure out that either a Monday or a Wednesday has to be the day that no plant is exhibited, that might be a good framing opportunity. So that leaves frames. 27% of all stacked ordering games can be framed. And what that means is that you can create multiple game boards, follow the inferences, and then use those game boards in order to answer the questions more efficiently. So like in the game we looked at earlier, one way in which you can create frames on a stacked ordering game is with a partial tree. And if there's an element within that partial tree that's limited to a couple places on the game board, you want to go ahead and follow that out. So maybe in this case, like F1 was either going to go in the 2nd position or the 3rd position in the bottom row. And so you can create game board A and game board B, and then make any inferences that follow from that information. Another variation that allows for frames to occur on stacked ordering games is large blocks. Sometimes these blocks are within the same row, and sometimes they're across rows. Doesn't really matter. What the idea is, if there's a block that's limited to 2 or maybe 3 places on the game board, it's a good idea to go ahead and run that out. So if you've got 2 variable sets, F, G, H, J, and K, versus R, S, T, U, and V, we're going to run them 1 through 5. If you have a block that's going to separate G and V with 2 spaces in between it, and there's only 2 places for that block to go, it's a good idea to go ahead and follow that out, because it's going to lead to some inferences, and those inferences will give you a lot more structure that you can then use to answer the questions more efficiently. So remember, the logic game process in overall is first find the game board or create the game board. This is where the game types become helpful, because each game type has a different kind of a game board. And then you want to notate the rules, and then you want to make any inferences that follow from those rules. And then after you've had a chance to set the game up properly, look at the questions. So you spot a stacked ordering game when you're working on an ordering game. There are multiple variable sets, and the connection between the variable sets is not established at the beginning of the game. You want to use this. The game board you want to use for a stacked ordering game is a stacked ordering line, which is essentially your ordering line plus however many rows you need in order to track the information. The rules you should expect to see are position exclusions, fixed positions, relative relationships, and conditional relationships. The mechanisms that are common for creating frames are blocks and partial trees. And the mechanisms that are common for creating frames are blocks and partial trees. So that's it for today's lesson on stacked ordering games. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons, or visit us today at lsatlab.com.